Okay. So first of all, why would you care about privacy in the first place when it comes to ChatGPT and LLMs in general? First of all, you got to think about there's a lot of legal obligations when it comes to handling customer data that contains personal information. I'll go over a couple of them later on. There are continuous fines for not complying with the legal obligations, or in the case of a data breach, there's also a lot to lose in case of customer trust. If they find out that either their PII is being misused, PII being personally identifiable information, or if there is a data breach of their personal information, one way or another. And what you need to keep in mind when thinking about data protection regulation compliance is many of them do follow GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation in the European Union that applies to any EU citizen, regardless of where they are in the world. And some things that you need to think about are you need positive consent to use personal information for specific purposes. You have to minimize the data to only the amount of data that you absolutely need. You have to be able to track wherever that data are stored. You have to be able to answer access to information requests and requests to be forgotten. And these two in particular are pretty tricky when it comes to LLMs. If you trained on personal information in the first place, how are you going to make the LLM forget that PII? And then you also need to think about data portability, but I will that's not too relevant to this talk. So it's also really important to care because the market cares beyond regulation. In part, this plunge from the Meta stocks, which was the biggest plunge in stock market history, was due to the fact that, one, Apple changed their privacy settings for users to be able to tell apps not to track certain behavior that Meta was relying for targeted advertisement. And then it's also due to the fact that investors had been seeing for a while that due to lack of trust in Meta, people had been not subscribing as frequently to Facebook or unsubscribing. Then we've got this first data leak that happened with OpenAI. So another reason to be careful with PIIs, because you never know when something like this can happen. This temporarily exposed chat histories to other users, and that may have contained credit card information. And then we did have a few countries start banning ChatGPT. Italy banned ChatGPT temporarily and then unbanned it once they were convinced that OpenAI was taking privacy a little bit more seriously. There's the French civil minister saying that ChatGPT doesn't respect privacy laws. So it not respecting privacy laws these days gets a pretty bad rep. And this isn't something that is new. There is, for example, evidence that this is something very important to look at from previous issues with that companies have had with mismanaging PII. In particular, this South Korean chatbot company that had built a love bot, and the company is called Scatterlab, had been boasting about the billions of conversations that they have between users, and next thing they knew, the chatbot started spewing out entire names and addresses and so on because they hadn't worried about how to deal with that PII at training. So the model had been memorizing that information per se. And the research community knew about this earlier on. In 2019, for example, there's this paper by Carlini et al. Called "The Secret Share: Evaluating and Testing Unintended Memorization in Neural Networks." And what they did was they trained a character language model on the Pentree Bank data set, and they had included a canary, which was a set of numbers in the Pentree Bank data set, and then measured the perplexity of the model, so the surprise of the model at seeing random sequences of numbers, and the sequence of numbers that was in the Penn tree bank data set that they had trained on had lower surprise or lower perplexity. So it was easy to extract in that sense what information had been in there. And there was this other paper by Carlini et al. From 2020 that showed GPT-2 spewing out addresses and other personal information that it had been trained on from the internet. And one reason why this is really really important to keep in mind that it might not be the best thing to do is the GDPR, as I had mentioned, applies to any EU citizen, regardless of where they are in the world. You need positive consent to use the personal information of people for different purposes. You need to specify which purposes. And it is very unlikely that the websites that they trained on all had consent from the users to use their personal information for training GPT-2. So aside from the concern about training on PII, there is a concern of sharing your PII with a third party. And big tech has been tackling this quite heavily over the last few months. So Microsoft in particular was the first to offer ChatGPT in a secure environment called Azure OpenAI Services. And Microsoft's actually been quite vocal about the importance of privacy for many years now. With I believe Satya Nadella pointing out that it is a human right to have privacy. And what they have put in place is this ability also for Azure OpenAI to run on your data within your environment. And while this is really great and a really important step to not have third-party access your data, it is important to keep in mind that when you are using your own data to fine-tune or to inform the large language models, you are exposing that personal information to potentially other people within the organization who might not have the same levels of access control to the original data as they do to the model. So you need to keep that access control in mind, or make sure that you're removing personal information and confidential information. And one way of dealing with that is by de-identifying the data before training the models. And one interesting thing that we found at Private AI is that when you de-identify the data first, send the de-identified data to one of the large language models, including Azure OpenAI, you can then reintegrate the information and have a very seamless experience without having shared that personal data. And this is something that can also be used for removing the personal information before fine-tuning or informing a model, preventing that model from identifying the PII or from sharing the PII more broadly. And this is a fairly difficult problem because it's just such a broad scope of different types of personal information. It has to be done across multiple languages, and it has to be done in the customer's environment for actual privacy. Next, we see Salesforce has also been super vocal with Einstein GPT, and the next slide will be about what Einstein GPT is. But one thing I wanted to point out is what the CEO of Salesforce had said. Benioff said during the event that every CEO he has spoken to has brought up that the AI trust gap between their desire to rapidly move forward with the technology and the problem that large language models introduce in corporate environments. So what they introduced is Einstein GPT, which allows you to train on to use large language models directly on your Salesforce data. So the way that it works is you've got the secure data retrieval, then the dynamic grounding, then the data masking, which I was mentioning before for the PII, and then it goes into the large language model within a trusted environment. There's toxicity detection, and then, of course, an audit trail, which is important for many industries, and that can inform your customer or relationship management applications. But one thing I wanted to point out is that they say, with respect to Einstein bots, customers may not submit PHI, that's protected health information, or use PHI in any utterance records, or B, enable any answer automation or input recommended features or functionality of Einstein bots that could result in the submission or use of PHI therein. So each user is still very much responsible for any protected health information that may appear in their data, and then used to and then be processed by the Salesforce large language model. And this is really tricky because you're dealing with a customer relationship management tool, and customers can say anything, and your sales folks can type in anything. And oftentimes, if you have, for example, a call transcript, they might be talking about what their mother going to the hospital last weekend, and all of the health concerns that there were about her condition. And all of a sudden, you have to deal with protected health information without actually being a healthcare company. So it is something to keep in mind, and be able to figure out a solution for it to quickly remove the personal and protected health information when you don't need it. So aside from GDPR, HIPAA is one of the regulations that you need to be concerned about if you're dealing with, for example, American healthcare information in the US. And what this basically, there are 18 different entity types that you need to remove in order to be to comply with HIPAA safe harbor. But if you're removing the healthcare information itself, that is something to consider, that you might not necessarily need to remove names and such. Oftentimes, the way that HIPAA is thought of is you want to maximize the amount of information that will inform you about the healthcare aspect of things, so the disease, the symptoms, so that doctors can do researchers can perform research with the data. But in this case, you're trying to do the opposite, which is remove as much health information as possible and maintain the other data. And then we've got PCI DSS standards to comply with, which is very relevant to sales calls, for example, because you've got to deal with credit card information, potentially social security numbers. It's data that you have to, by law, internationally handle in a very different way. And what you're concerned about there is not necessarily de-identification, but identity theft. So you want to remove the bits and pieces that can lead to identity theft. And one thing to keep in mind is when you're thinking about what kind of personal information you are feeding into the large language models, not all identifiers are the same. So you've got direct identifiers like exact entire names, exact addresses, that will approximately identify an individual to a very small set of people, or uniquely. And then you've got quasi-identifiers, which when combined together can lead to the re-identification of an individual. So you've got to be careful about both of these. You want to remove as much as possible that you don't need for the particular context that you're dealing with. Generally, combining quasi-identifiers together leads to an exponential risk of re-identification. And one thing I want to point out is that you have to be careful about how you use the terminology for this. So I'll point out a few instances of where de-identification wasn't done well enough. Usually because humans didn't know better at the time, or sometimes because a lot of companies think you just remove a social security number and a name and you're good. In this case, it said, we found that patients can be re-identified without decryption through a process of linking the unencrypted parts of the record with known information about the individual, such as medical procedure and year of birth. And then in this case, a 2016 study found that 42.8% risk of matching anesthesia records to the Texas inpatient public use data file for 2013 using data such as age, sex, hospital, and year. And then in this one, it's a pretty famous study, Sweeney, or pretty famous uncovering. Sweeney was then able to uniquely identify the medical record of Governor Weld. She did this by noting that only 6 voters in Cambridge had the same birth date as the governor, only 3 of those were male, and only 1 of those lived in the same zip code as him. So that's all pieces to keep in mind when you're thinking about just how much personal information you are removing from the data that you're using to train a model or that you're sending through to a third-party LLM. And ultimately, I want to finish with letting you know that you should be careful with this, but also that being careful about this is going to become par for the course. It looks like the industry is leaning more and more towards, let's make sure we maintain customer trust, and we have these big players like Microsoft and Salesforce putting in a lot of money into solving these problems, and I think the industry will be following suit. So thank you. Open to any questions you may have, and you can try the private GPT that I showed a little bit about online if you'd like. It's free to try it.